Right, so for robot, so the file I'm going to use as the demonstration is the new FoodOn process spreadsheet file. At the very basic level, each robot file has a bunch of columns, and each column is turned into either a term annotation, a label, identifier, or some other axiom or tag annotation or to that term. So each row is a term in the that can be turned into a term in an OWL file. And these OWL files can work on their own, the ones that are created out of a robot file. The robot will create a standalone ontology file, but the trick is to make it nice to have it look like an import file into the main one. So to explain this is to just review the basics of what robot does. And that involves taking a look at the headers of this table of terms and what each one gets converted into. And you're free to interrupt and ask questions as we go. So robot, which James Overton and a couple of others have created over the years, is a separate command you can download directly from a GitHub repository. And it is a command line Unix tool. And it will just take a look at a text file, a tabular text file, that looks very much like this one. And I'll just show you the step to convert this textual content onto a command line. But the first part of it all is just to make sense of what the text file has in it. And the first two rows of the text file are what robot first pays attention to. It actually doesn't care too much what you label each column on the first row, but the second row is what it's reading very carefully to take the content of any cell and convert it into an ontology term entry part. So robot needs a identifier for the term that you want to include in the output OWL file. So it's up to us to supply that term identifier. And this is called a prefix notation. You can actually define what the prefix means in terms of a longer URL for the term, and then the identifier part. So the first thing is, if we want to add a new term to this table, then we do have to get the ID out for the new term. And so for now, just ask me for a new ID. And in the robot file, you can actually insert a new row anywhere if you want to keep the terms organized, or you can add your term at the very end. So identifier for the term, and then the next column is the label. And so when you take a look at the robot's help information, what it says is that it can provide for any term these A for annotation entries, and L says it's a language sensitive annotation. And that means you can add at English or at Italian or whatever language variation you want. And the content will be marked as being in that language in the OWL file. So we've actually got that going for not this file, but some others that allow multilingual synonyms, for example. Okay, so this gets turned into a term label. This parent column is the plain English label for what the parent should be. And SC means superclass, and % split equals is this other little thing you can add to a field if you think there might be more than one value. So this is what allows us to multi-home terms in this table. The food packaging process in this case will be placed underneath food transformation process, but there are actually a few terms in here that are multi-homed somewhere. Well, these are examples of synonyms, multiple synonyms for a term, but there are actually examples of multi-homing. There we go. So water addition process currently is a process that's under food component addition process and water addition or removal process. All right, now these two, if we were to just have some generic terms that don't need any other axioms, we would just have another column for definition of the term. So annotation, language sensitive, and the IAO part is the term identifier that actually means definition in the Obo Foundry world. And add English means it'll be an English definition. The comments, we'll have English comments. We're going to have cross-reference and maybe a synonym or two. Those are common fields that other robot import files will have, and we'll take a look at more of them in a moment. But what's unique about the process ontology parts is that they can all possibly have inputs and outputs. And that's what this tag is doing here. It's saying a subclass of has input some, and this percentage sign is actually the variable. It's whatever content you have in the field, it's going to go into that spot. And we can have several inputs. That's what the split part is doing. Same with the output. So if you go take a look at some of these foods, like food fermentation, this process has an output, food fermented. And that's another term that's actually defined elsewhere in the ontology, in the main FoodOn edit file. This is kind of like the noun, and this is the verb. And the verb, the process creating the noun or the material entity. I have taken a brief stab at identifying foods that are the output of processes in a general way. So milled food, canned food, fried food, hulled, cleaned, packaged. They're all from the output of these processes. But I'm sure we need to take a look at to see what other foods by process or quality should be added to this table. So that's going to be one curation task. If you are using or see a process that you know has an existing FoodOn term that should be in this column, you're now free to add it. And if you don't have edit rights on this table, I'll give them to you. Same with input. If we know a particular kind of food is an input to a process. That's a little bit trickier to define exactly what kind of thing is an input. That's why this column isn't so populated. But for example, pre-harvest food material is definitely the input for a food harvesting process. So this term is general enough to make sense to put in as an input. Any questions so far?
Yes, it's Magali. Yeah. Do you hear me? Yes. Just a question. If we have some proposal to add in the as output column, should we indicate our name or something to identify us?
Right. Okay. So yeah. So how should we approach recommending changes here? And One of the,
Because I am interested in this task, but how should I do that?
yeah, right. So in OB, the pattern is that any new term that wants to be introduced or any a change of a term is actually talked about as an item in the call. So ultimately, we will all have a chance to comment on any changes that people want to make. But what I suggest is if there's a new term that you want to add here, you can just type it in, but add a comment that it's you who's that you're adding that particular thing.
May I suggest something? This is Sunday.
Yep.
To take it a step further, I find that when you're suggesting something or when you're proposing a new term, trying to find a justification for it helps a lot in your thought process and in the outcome. So it's a mere suggestion that when you're suggesting a term, if you could put a word or two even just to remind yourself what your justification is for that proposal, I think that will help the readers and yourself to kind of revisit that thought process. Yeah, something like that, exactly.
Right.
And then once it's time for us to discuss, it will be easier for everyone.
Right. And so that touches on like where are the entry points for all of these changes. So some of the changes are going to be coming from issues on GitHub, and then others will be people wanting to add terms in the robot style in a bit more bulk. We'll be, for any new robot tables or any chunks of work, adding a whole variety of terms, we'll be in the know because somebody will be leading that action. But when it gets down to individual terms, it will be the person who's proposing them to talk through the justification and to get feedback on whether the definition has got enough of an Aristotelian form or not. And so it's certainly been my experience that each one of my proposals gets grilled by the OB crew, and rightfully so. That's what it is, our QA, quality assurance, doing that. Okay, so
Damien, I'm just curious, the second row that you have discussed, is there any specific syntax to this?
yes, so all of the all of the detailed information, there's going to be two ways to learn about that. One is I won't be talking about that syntax in detail, but I will be having a list of all the different robot files that are doing things, and you'll be able to see the robot file translation into the OWL file. So that's the copycat version. If you see the right column information for what you want to do, that column can then be added to a new robot file table. The actual guts and the detail of what these commands are doing is in robot.obolibrary.org.
Okay.
And robot is not just a tool for converting templates into OWL import files. It's actually got tons and tons of things packed into it. It's a Sparkle query engine. You can run a little one-liner Sparkle query using robot on an OWL file. You can merge OWL files. You can extract chunks, pieces of hierarchy of OWL files. So this template command is actually just one option. But in that, it goes through all of the headers and the syntax, everything I've been talking about here.
The nitty-gritties, okay.
There's some little details that aren't immediately apparent, such as you can use this label term here if you want in your robot file as an example. to specify a label for a term, but that label command is equivalent to typing RDFS label, but what it doesn't do is let you control the language of the label. So in fact, for FoodOn, I'm discouraging use of label because we need to actually specify the language of the field. That's just a little technical example of why FoodOn's robot files are different. Here's all of the annotations and other things. It's written at a level that you kind of have to know already what the guts, the bits and pieces of OWL files are. And so that learning will be reinforced when we actually get into Protégé editing, because all of this stuff will show up in Protégé again. Here's the SRC that we were using. And they have some examples. But back to
this document. Sorry to interrupt. So this particular documentation provides some light on the table that you discussed. Yeah, I can clearly see.
All of the syntax here is coming straight from that.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay.
Well, actually, what I'm going to do, there is a robot tab here on this Google Sheet, and the robot tab has the command that I run to generate the OWL file, the process import OWL file from this Google Sheet right here. So I'm leaving it in there so that people can try this at home at their own risk. And yeah, so I'll get back to what happens on the command line and how to generate the import file in a sec. So that's the input, the output. Sometimes if we're so confident that our term can be matched logically out there in the world to things of a certain kind, we can create these equivalency axioms. I'll talk about that another time, especially for some of the robot templates where that's more pertinent, like the food organismal part. There's the definition. Comments are, well, let's talk about definitions here. So the Obo Foundry community really encourages that, or at least a number of the curators do, that the label contains the name of the term, but that the definition doesn't repeat that name. Instead, it begins with a pronoun like a, which refers to the label. And you just launch into the Aristotelian definition, which is AX is a Y, a class is a superclass that has some differentiate, and I guess they call that genus type distinction. So a process, you mentioned the parent class, and then you get into why this particular term is different from its siblings, or what's so unique about it. But we try to make those one-liners and any other kind of comments that elucidate on what this process is would be stuffed into the comment field. So, and that's true of other terms too. So these aren't finalized, these process definitions. They've been through one quick edit from their Langual home. Some of them are new, like Ikejimi. I don't think that one's even in Langual. I added it, but we would probably take this out and add it to the comment field, unless there was some piece of extra information that really made this process distinct from some other sibling, and it had to be in the definition. So that's an example of an edit that one could try to shorten the definitions in this column and take the ancillary stuff and put it over in the comment field. The definitions, if we're making them up or if they're coming from Langual, then they can be indicated there. And that's the source. Right now, we're not saying that here, so that would be an example of a little bit of a help. We just say, Langual is the source of the definition. This cross-reference is actually pointing an ability for any to add the a URL or database reference for any term. And so in this case, these are all processes that originated in Langual. And if you follow the link, it will take you straight to the Langual entry, hopefully in a speedy fashion. Right. So just thought I'd show that. There is a definition source field, or there should be. Yes, here. And so that's where, if we're adding a new term, especially something coming from Wikipedia or some other source, you add the URL for that term source there. You can put yourself as an author. If you do more changes on a term, you can add yourself. And then you also get some credit for contributing. And then the curation status for terms that we know we should discuss as a group. Everything starts with the requires discussion status and then moves on to ready for publishing. And that's kind of the final status that a term has. And for new terms, we can add a date of creation. There's some synonymy here. This synonym term is just a general synonym category that we haven't curated yet into one of the more specific types of synonymy, exact or narrow. Preferably all our synonyms end up in exact or narrow, but there are still legacy entries for synonym that are in this more general category.
Damien, just a question, please.
Yeah.
What about the different spelling of a word? For example, I noticed that you have ikejime or ikajime, two different spelling.
Yeah.
So perhaps
so
and in the definition also you have another spelling.
Oh, really? Good. Quick, a quick eye.
So,
good. Excellent.
I was wondering what about spelling?
Excellent.
Is that if there is two spelling, is that a synonym or?
Yeah, I've been using it as synonym. I think one label, one language per label for the name, but synonymy has to at the moment, for simplicity's sake, cover all of the variations of spelling. Now, one real hassle, and maybe this happens in French as well, but one real hassle is that England, UK English is different from North American spellings in a number of cases. And whose spelling to side with is just a tortuous decision. And I haven't been super systematic about it. But suffice to say that the UK or the US spelling may end up in the label, and then the synonymy will capture the American or the UK variation of spelling. One of the issues is that Langual was first curated for the first 20 years in the US, and then it moved to Europe and started picking up British spellings for things. So, for new terms.
So this is not homogeneous, you mean?
It's not. It's not, right. It's not just US spellings preferred over UK spellings for term labels. There's a bit of variation. But the objective in terms of text mining is to make sure that those variations are captured in the synonymy. We could, as a group, especially with our American counterparts, and not having to happen any British UK representation at the moment, might be a debate happening between our European and American curators. And the Canadians are sort of siding with the Europeans a little bit, maybe. I don't know.
I'm a European, but I am French, sorry.
Right, no, what I'm alluding to is that European English is sort of UK English and not American English, I presume, but
a British one.
Canadian. We're sort of more on the British side for color and all sorts of words like that.
So in the present case, would you add a synonym in the column for synonymy? Or
for
just
which?
An example here. Would you ask a synonym for ikejimi for the other spelling? So
yes, I'll add that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in that case, it's an exact synonym.
A which?
What is the difference between exact synonym or?
Oh, okay. So this is all the synonyms that were brought in from Langual ended up in this general synonym column. But as curators, it would be better if we moved them to exact or narrow. And the difference is that an exact synonym means that a term, at least in one sense, can point to the very same thing. So corn husking process and husking are semantically exact. But if there was a particular kind of husking that was mentioned or can be associated with a husking process like quick machined husking or whatever, that could go into narrow synonym because it's the definition for husking encompasses that, but also encompasses other kinds of husking, for example. So it's an example that usually if there are terms in the narrow synonym column, it means that we as ontologists haven't bothered to actually create separate terms for these more specific semantic variations of a term. It's sort of like the work to do some other time column for vocabulary. But most of our terms should be exact synonyms so that if text matching happens, the text matching can say, yes, this sense of a word is exactly this. There may be exact synonyms that have different senses to them. So it's not solving that problem, but it is making sure that that this synonym isn't too broadly applied. There is as well an OvaFoundry term for broad synonym, but generally if a term has a broad synonym, there should actually be a term for that broad synonym as a separate ontology entity. So we shouldn't be seeing the use of broad synonym. That's why I didn't even include it in as a column here. Okay, any other questions? Okay, it's 8:46. What I'm going to do is just show how this ends up producing an OWL file. And the two steps for that are that this has to be converted into a text file. And the easiest way to do that, I mean, I guess there's file, save, or export, maybe. Download. You can download as a TSV, tab separated values. So that's one way to go, and then move it off to the right folder. Or the other way, if you've got a Linux command line at the right location, you can actually cut and paste a file straight into a command line or on the text or in a text editor. So I'm going to just, I'm in the FoodOn folder right now, GitHub FoodOn source ontology folder. I'm moving to the imports subfolder. This is where all of the import files that the main FoodOn edit file mentions are located. And then underneath that is this robot folder. And this is where the text files for the currently roboticized content are. So the one we're after is this process.tsv. And most of the time you can do a Linux shortcut cat to process.tsv. And what that does is take anything that you enter the command line and put it into that file. Now I'm just going to show you the example where that doesn't work, which is our current example. So here I am, Control V or Command V to copy all the text in. But there's some characters in there that this isn't quite working for. So I actually have to do, it is getting some of the text in, but in some characters is causing it to stop with that approach. So I am actually using a separate approach to get the content in, which is to open up the process.tsv file and completely replace it with the stuff I've just cut and pasted from this food process. And then by saving it, I now have the full process TSV file. And there are two places I can go to look up how to convert it into an OWL file. One of them is that spreadsheet tab right here, the robot tab. This command right here is the robot command with some extra stuff in it to tell the robot file what all these prefixes mean, so that when it's looking at those shorthand terms and their IDs, that it can convert that into a URL, a proper longer URL for each term. And these are the prefixes that are needed. The last thing in the detail here is that you'll see that in the process folder, there are these terms mentioned just by their labels, not by their identifiers. You can certainly mention a term by its identifier, but to mention a term by a label, the only way that robot will know what this label actually maps to is if it has a source of all of the FoodOn terms that are actively in use. And that's why I have as an input the FoodOn merged file. It's just using this one piece of the command to go look up all the labels of terms so it knows what the references are and can create the proper OWL output. So having this command, which I'll just cut and paste right to the command line. Or I should say the output of this is a file that's either in the current directory or it's one directory up. So I'm going to just do this in the current directory just to make a point. We'll see it pop up. It doesn't take very long, usually. Well, guess what? It didn't like has output some thingy at row 10. Okay. Because it couldn't find that name. So I had left thingy in there. And that's an example of an error you'll get if the robot file finds a reference. Unknown thing. Cannot be parsed. Encountered unknown thing. Thingy. Unknown thingy. So I got to take this out of here. Take the content again. I could have corrected it directly in this file, but I want to make sure I'm correcting it back in the original. Resave. Saved. And then run the robot command again. So, and this time, no problems. So this time, if I list, there's now this new robot process import file. And I'm going to open that up in ontology directly. GitHub, FoodOn, source ontology, imports. Here's the robot folder that we were working in. And then you'll see in that same import folder, you'll see all the robot output files, one corresponding to each text file. So robot process import, I'm clicking on it, and that'll open it in a new copy of Protégé. So we're just taking a look at what it looks like all by itself. So it's got this hierarchy. These are all the food processes that have been imported. And it has created these axioms, as well as all of those annotations coming from the columns of the robot table. So you can create your own ontology and manage it entirely from a single spreadsheet, and it will convert it into OWL this way. We're using it as an import file, which means that it's making reference to some terms that may not themselves be in the spreadsheet. This is an example of one of them. This is actually import or output, and input has input and has output, these two relations. But this import file by itself doesn't know the names of those. It's only if it was imported into foodon.edit that foodon.edit also has the labels for these terms, and we'll show them. And that's what you see when you go to cooking by microwave right now. So because FoodOn knows the labels of those relations, it gets to put those, display them for you. So I've skirted around introducing Protégé's view of everything and its bits and pieces, but that's a quick look at how the robot file can stand on its own to do that. I think that about wraps it up for robot use.